Okie dokie. So we got a really interesting panel coming to the stage next here. So if you were just in this room prior to lunch, there was another interesting panel focusing on African Nova Scotian communities in HRM. Now we're going to look a bit more rural. We're going to go to Weymouth Falls, over there by Digby. Shout out to Weymouth Falls. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Now, who's been to Weymouth Falls that isn't from there? Like, yes, yes. Michelle and I actually, Michelle Cooper Iverson here from BC, we went to Weymouth Falls. We got the wrong address from Shakara. We ended up parked next to a closed bridge. We were like, do we walk? Then the gas light went on. We had no gas left. Then Shakara was like, oh, here's the right address. We went to some other house. It was the wrong house. So we grew together in Weymouth Falls. Yes, yes, deeply rooted. All right. So before we begin, I want to thank Shakara for putting this together because it's a very interesting panel with a lot of cool perspectives here to speak on this and really dig deep into what they are doing up there. So first, I'll introduce you guys and you can come to the stage as I introduce you if that works. Or are you gonna stay here? Okay, sorry, excuse me. I'll just say who everybody is and then I'll let them go for it. So first we have Shakara Grant. She is the founder of, one of the founders of Weymouth Falls Community Land Trust. She's been very active with the Canadian Network of Community Land Trust ever since I've taken on this role. So actually, a lot of gratitude goes out to Shakara and all her work and care that she puts into things. If you've had the pleasure of meeting her or working with her, you know she really puts her heart into it and is wonderful to work with. And then we have Mr. Chuck Smith, looking spiffy in the suit. No. And he's the board member of the Greenville Community Center Association. And then we have Sophia Munoz. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Climate lead for the wonderful Clean Foundation. They do a lot of cool work here in the province. You should check it out. And then finally, last but not least, we have Zara Williams, architect and principal and director of operations at ZAP Architecture and Planning. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Shakara to lead this great session. We're going to go to about 2:30 and then we'll have a networking break. Clap.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right. So we're actually going to start with a few presentations. Actually, most of the session is going to be presentations. And then at the end, we're going to move into like a panel style discussion where everyone can ask any questions they might have about the work that we're doing. So as you can see, our presentation is titled Prioritizing Preservation, Why We're Not Building New Yet. And our goal here is to demonstrate how Community Land Trust can blend technical expertise with community memories in a way that actually elevates our understanding of place. So as Nat mentioned, it won't just be me presenting. We also brought our technical experts, Mr. Chuck, Sophia, and Zara with us, who will also give their takes on how we're able to embed heritage preservation, community knowledge, and lived experience into the day-to-day work. And we're also hopeful that you'll be able to replicate some of this stuff if you find that it's relevant to your CLTs. Right, that works, great. So just to introduce myself a little bit more. So, my name is Shakara Grant. I'm the founder and president of the Weymouth Falls Community Land Trust. And I was inspired to start a community land trust after a personal family experience of land loss. So through that process, I started talking to other people from the community and came to find that it wasn't a unique experience in any way, and that we needed a mechanism that could help stop this land loss that was happening so often in our communities. So I am a descendant of Cherry Brook and Weymouth Falls. So I've actually never lived in Weymouth Falls, but my family comes from that area, and I'll kind of explain what it means for African Nova Scotians to be tied to place. And I'm currently doing a master's as well in sociology at Dalhousie University, looking at African Nova Scotian culture. So some of the photos that I've shared there with you are photos of me over the years at the Weymouth Falls reunions. And so again, even though it's a deeply rural community, a lot of people have been displaced. My goal here was to show that we're still so deeply connected to place, and that we keep going back generation after generation, working to revive that community. All right. And so I kind of gave a little hint earlier that I was going to go into this, but again, I've never lived in this community, but I say that I'm rooted in it. And so what does that actually mean? I wanted to kind of show you what it looks like for African Nova Scotians and our connections to place. So I'm a 7th generation descendant of Catherine Jarvis, which makes me an 8th generation African Nova Scotian. And so I've actually been corresponding with a loyalist researcher recently who confirmed that Catherine Jarvis was the longest surviving loyalist, Black or white, known to have settled in Nova Scotia because she lived to be 110 years old. And so because she lived to be 110 years old, her death was eventually announced through newspaper articles in both Canada and the United States. And you'll see that there's some date confusion there, but the Black loyalists arrived, in the 1780s. But what I want to point out here is that in these obituaries, it's written that Catherine Jarvis was born into enslavement in the United States before the Declaration of American Independence and was brought to Nova Scotia by her enslaver around 1782. So when she was brought here, she originally settled in Shelburne. She then relocated to Yarmouth, but it's in Weymouth Falls where she ended up spending the last 20 years of her life, living with her son, Joseph Jarvis, who was a lifelong resident of Weymouth Falls. So what this means for me is that from at least, the 1800s, early 1800s, to the 1970s, when my grandmother left the community due to, the lack of jobs that often plagues rural communities, every generation of my family between that has made significant contributions to this community, and they spent their lives cultivating and stewarding the land there. And so while that does sound like, perhaps a remarkable story, it's not in any way unique when you consider the legacy for African Nova Scotians. And there's many families across this province that share similar remarkable stories. So I wanted to share with you a definition for African Nova Scotians that was created by Dalhousie University's African Nova Scotian Strategy Advisory Council. And it reads that, quote, African Nova Scotians are a distinct people who descend from free and enslaved Black planters, Black loyalists, Black refugees, Maroons, and other Black people who inhabited the original 52 land-based Black communities in that part of Mi'kma'ki known as Nova Scotia. African Nova Scotians were settled in the province through enslavement or fleeing enslavement elsewhere and continue to experience all manner of structural, systemic, and individual discrimination. Yet, our experience is equally characterized by resistance, resilience, creativity, spirituality, and hope that has profoundly shaped our families and communities and this province and country. Indeed, until 1961, more than half of all Black people in Canada were African Nova Scotian, end quote. And I also have to shout her out, even though it's not planned, but I will say, Melissa Marsman is part of the committee that helped create that definition. And we heard from Chino earlier, if you don't legislate or define things, then it allows it to be left up for interpretation. So I think it's really important to ground what we're talking about and make sure that we're all, understanding the language that's being used. So that's why I wanted to share that definition. But what I also want to say here is that even though we have this long presence in these communities, it hasn't always resulted in ownership. And African Nova Scotians have demonstrated a commitment to maintaining a perpetual presence in a lot of these communities that they built. But again, ownership sometimes is absent. So we become responsible stewards of these communities. But what I see for CLTs or through CLTs is really an opportunity to correct that historical wrong and to actually give that power back to community of ownership that they've been systemically denied. So today, I'm really excited to tell you about how the community of Weymouth Falls is leveraging the CLT model to ensure that no matter where us descendants end up, our community and the legacy of our communities can never be erased. So I had a few people ask me if they could go to Weymouth Falls, visit. And I'm going to point out where it is. it would take, you wouldn't be able to come to the summit if you wanted to spend a day doing that. But so where we are located currently is, if you can see the map, where the Nova Scotia is written in capitals, that's like the Halifax Regional Municipality. So that's the area where we are right now. And Weymouth Falls is where the red dot is the pin. So it's in the southwest region of Nova Scotia. It's 2.5-hour drive from here. So you'd at least have to stay overnight if you were going. But it's located within the Digby municipality. And our community has been home to, nationally recognized people. So it was home to the nationally recognized, or sorry, the world renowned, actually, before someone gets me, from Weymouth Falls, the, the world renowned boxer, the late Sam Langford. It was also home to the nationally recognized folk artist, the late Harold Cromwell. And it's also home to living, legends that we need to start recognizing a little bit more, like Dr. Henry Bishop and, of course, Juanita Peters, who's on our board. So members of our communities have made such significant contributions to the local, provincial, and national landscape. And the community itself, in the other photo, I included the boundary as per the province, but just using that boundary, because we haven't had, we might recommend changes, but as it is currently with the provincial boundary, it's actually a 2,800 hectare community. So that's a lot of land, a lot of potential. It borders the Sissebu River, and it's deeply rural. And so when I say that, the nearest town that would have servicing, centralized servicing, is Digby, and that's a 25-minute drive from the community of Weymouth Falls. So it's truly deeply rural. And so I think through my introduction, I feel like I made the case as to why CLTs make so much sense for African Nova Scotians, and why, we're really pushing this, or I should say they're making so much progress, and why it's taken up, there's so much interest in our communities. But as we already learned today, or maybe some of you already knew, the roots of the Community Land Trust are both Black and rural. And it's really important that we recognize that as we continue to use this mechanism. So I won't go into it too much, because Nat already gave our history lesson earlier, but what's important to recognize is that New Communities, Inc. was the first ever community land trust. They were responding to specific experiences that were happening to African American farmers, tenant farmers actually, who were being displaced from their land, not even for voting, but for exercising their right to register to vote. That was leading to displacement by their white landlords, where they would work and live. So the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, and New Communities was established in 1969 as a direct response to those experiences, among other things, of course. And while I'm not saying here that New Communities, invented land trusting, because we know this is a very, it exists culturally. There's, we've seen this system being used before that. The innovation that they contributed, and why we credit them with the CLT in name, is because they were the ones that created this democratic process that can still function within the colonized society, but to make decisions over land that was held in trust. And so that was new. So to give the actual community decision-making power about how land was held, that's what they offered the movement. And of course, they created it in name. Now, something else I think is particularly relevant for us in Weymouth Falls is that in their inaugural Articles of Incorporation, New Communities actually defined themselves as a nonprofit organization to hold land in perpetual trust for the permanent use of rural communities. And I always find that interesting, because it's exactly what we're trying to do in Weymouth Falls. And so now that I've given you the background, I feel like we're all kind of on the same page here. The Weymouth Falls Community Land Trust is a living commitment to self-determination that stewards the cultural, historic, and land-based heritage of Weymouth Falls. So we are building an empowered, engaged community to ensure it is preserved for future generations. That's our goal. And, I would say the build up to this movement, or this moment even, has been slow and steady, because we've been very intentional about the way that we're building. We want to have an organization that's operationally and financially strong to make sure that it will be able to sustain itself in the future. And so now I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of some of the big milestones that we met over the last few years, to give you an idea of how we got to this point. So we incorporated in 2023, so May of 2023. And this was after like about a year of kind of learning about the CLT, doing some research, and trying to understand would this mechanism make sense in our community. And of course it does. After we incorporated, the first thing that we really prioritized was getting a website, because I gave you my own history of and connection to the community. But again, we now have like a Weymouth Falls diaspora who are located all over the world. And so we needed to create a mechanism that the people that don't live here can still engage with the work that we're doing. So that's why the website was so crucial to us when we founded. Also in that year, we worked with we engaged research students from the Masters of Science in Planning program at the University of Toronto, and they actually created a report for us that made the case as to why like a community land trust could still function given the deeply rural context. Now, moving into 2024, our focus was really on partnerships, professional development, and resource creation. And so we established multi-year partnerships with the community the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts through their community resilience cohort that we're a part of. We also established a multi-year relationship with the Clean Foundation through their Community Climate Capacity Program, which you'll be hearing more about. But it was really important that we insulated ourselves with the technical expertise needed to make sure that our work was still going. In May of 2024, we participated in the Liberated Land Trust Tour, also organized by the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts. And that was crucial to all of our organizations. That's where we met our play cousin, Damon, and the rest of the Rondo family. But it was really important because we were able to see how Black-focused community land trusts, co-ops, and just other like general economic models were functioning within the robust sector in the United States. So, I mean, the impact of that tour is clear when you look at where all of our organizations are now, but that was really instrumental. The other thing that we did is that we started to create resources, and we did this for two reasons. So where we are working in a grassroots, deeply rural context, it's not fair to assume that everyone in the community knows development or knows how to participate in an organization like this. So we wanted to create something that we could make sure that we're having a common understanding with the community that we're trying to work with. So that was kind of the big reason. But the other reason why we did this is because we wanted to show funders or folks who might want to invest in our organization that we're serious about this and that we're creating structures inside of our organization that will sustain, beyond us as board members, because that's, a big gap. Sometimes if someone leaves the board, then you lose everything that they know. So we're really trying to be intentional about creating these resources that will stay within the organization. And some of them say 2025 because that's just when they were finished, but the bulk of that work was done in 2024 to create them. And so I wanted to give you kind of an example of one of them. So this is our planning and design guidebook. So I provided the table of contents there. But this is providing an engineer's perspective of what needs to be done if you're looking to acquire property. As a grassroots community, we have people who hear about the land trust and they are suggesting parcels that we should acquire because a lot of people think it's just a process of buying land and building. And so being able to communicate that or have something that we can refer to show this is like some of the stuff we have to do before we can even think about buying the property. It helps us have a conversation and not just pacify our community, but actually make sure that they understand what it is that we're doing. So that's why something like that is really important. And we're looking at doing a similar guide from an architectural and a climate perspective as well, hopefully. But I just wanted to show, why we feel like creating stuff like this for organizations is so important. Now, moving into 2025. So our focus here was on securing funding for organizational development, research, and preservation projects. We took over hosting the Weymouth Falls reunion. And this is a huge deal because this is a biannual reunion that happens every 2 years in the community. It's been happening since 1995. And so for the community to trust us with that and then to deliver, it created, a new resurgence of interest in the work that we were doing. We also elected our board of directors at our AGM during the reunion. Most of them are here. Maybe raise your hand so people know who you are if they want to talk to you. Yeah. So that was huge because even, like I said, we've incorporated it in 2023, but we went through a process with the community to actually figure out what would our bylaws look like and how do we co-create this so that when we're adding people to our board, there is obviously some power there, but that they're already responding to what the community has said that they want. So that's why, we incorporated in May, we had, a board on paper, but the community has elected the board now 2 years later after we've created all of these internal resources. Oh yeah, I was gonna say what else? The big one. So, yeah. So something else that's I knew I was forgetting something, but I couldn't figure out what it was. So yeah, the big news for us in 2025 is that we acquired our first property. Um, now, Nat already talked about it. There's hints on the slide about what it is. I mean, if you look at our logo, maybe you'll see a familiar structure there. We're going to get into the details of that a little bit later in the presentation, especially with Zara. But what I wanted to do is to publicly thank some of the people that were part of that process. It was really tough going through that acquisition process. So I literally wrote down their names to thank them. But Tam was huge for us. I was like, should we? Yeah, we had a lot of phone calls around that time. Roger Grant, Shakara Joseph, Ali White, Rodney Small, and Nat Pace. Yeah, yeah. And there were so many other people, but I just had to make sure that we give them their flowers because, again, like the panel said earlier, there's so much that happens behind the scenes that you'll never see, and it's important for us to recognize the people that were really there in times of crisis. Put it that way. All right, so that was kind of a snapshot, like I said, of what we've been doing over the last few years. But what's really important and kind of the point of this presentation is that it's not possible without deep technical experts and strong partnerships, but strong partnerships with people that get what it is that you're trying to do. And so we've been working with many collaborators across a range of initiatives, but I wanted to invite 3 here today to share their insights specifically on how their work is shaping the future of our CLT, specifically through military research, climate planning, and design. And so I could imagine that the climate planning and design connection to our CLT is probably evident, but some of you might be wondering, what does military research have to do with this? Like how or why is that something that your CLT is focused on? And what we came to find out is that a lot of African Nova Scotian history lives through oral tradition. It's unrecorded, or if it's recorded, it's actively erased. And so we found that military archives are one of the few sources that offer detailed documentation of service members, which then in turn gives us a rare insight into the lives of people who lived, worked, and served on this land, which then helps us to connect our present-day CLT work to a much longer legacy of Black presence and resilience. So for example, and out of curiosity, I guess, how many of you have heard of the No. 2 Construction Battalion? All right, lots of Scotian hands there. So yeah, if you were at the Black Cultural Center yesterday, they have an exhibit on it, but the No. 2 Construction Battalion is so significant to the Canadian landscape, but we really haven't been talking for it really publicly. We only really started having those conversations about 5 years ago due to a national apology that came from then Prime Minister Trudeau. But the No. 2 Construction Battalion was the only all-Black battalion in Canadian military history. And with support from Veterans Affairs Canada, our land trust was able to identify that 11 men who served on the No. 2 Construction Battalion were actually from the community of Weymouth Falls. So that in turn allowed us to get that detailed account and record of these men, which then tells us a lot about the community. So with that, I'd now like to invite Mr. Chuck Smith up here. He's our lead military researcher, and he's going to share some of the work that he's done for us with regard to the No. 2 Construction Battalion. Sorry, stuff everywhere.
So overdressed for the, my wife told me not to do that, but I didn't listen to her. And I had my, dress coat, and actually I just bought it yesterday because I'm retired and I don't have need for that much. So I was searching through my things and I forgot my socks. So I know it's sort of fashionable to not have socks, but for me, I'm old school, so I feel uncomfortable without my socks. Anyway, it's been quite a couple weeks for me. me and my wife just celebrated our 50th anniversary. And yesterday was my birthday. So, and so when Shakira asked me to do this presentation, I never thought of all that. Yeah. And my wife said, lucky this wasn't on your birthday, or else you're not going. Anyway, I'd like to thank Shakira very much for selecting me to speak at this summit. It's been a real honor to be here. Last night was really, really motivating to see the energy, to see the interest in land. My dad always talked about having your own land and actually having your own place to live. That was really, really important. So in Yarmouth, we have two communities. We have Greenville, two Black communities, Greenville, and we have Yarmouth Town. I lived in Yarmouth Town, and hardly anybody in Yarmouth Town ever had their own property. So my dad rented. I remember I was 6 years old, and my grandmother, she said, "You stop renting. There's a house there on Southeast Street. You go out there and you get the money." And money was hard to come by because you're talking 1964, and where money was very difficult to come by. But somewhere he got the money, and we bought our own home. Now, we never had indoor plumbing. We never had sewer or water. So we were always drinking water out of a well, and the road wasn't paved. But you know what? It was our home. It was our home. The land was a bit swampy in that area, but still. And we're talking about one of the presentations about picking blueberries. That's how we lived. And I know Shakira said, "You only got 10 minutes. I said, "Yeah." How am I going to do this in 10 minutes? Because I love to talk and I love to tell stories. But I'm supposed to talk about the number 2 construction, and I will. First of all, I'll give you a little background about myself. I lived and worked in Yarmouth all my life except for a year, 4 years at Acadia University, where I received my BSc in physical education and recreation. I actually am a gym rat. I was a sports fanatic. Baseball was my first sport. Basketball was my second sport. I moved back to Yarmouth and couldn't find a job in recreation and physical education and rec, so I ended up luckily working for the federal government, and got a job with the federal government and worked for 35 years. I was an employment counselor / programs officer for those years. And I've also been a community volunteer. So I volunteered my time coaching baseball first and then basketball for about 35 to 40 years. I've done community. And what I'm proud about that is I've influenced a lot of young people, and some of those young people are coming back, and some of them have kids now, and they're coming back to say, "Thanks, Coach." And that's what means so much for me. I can trace my roots back to the Black Loyalists who came to Nova Scotia in 1784, and also the Black refugees. So why my interest in the military? Well, when I was young and in school, I was also in Army Cadets. And I was in Army Cadets from the time I was in grade 7 to grade 12. So that triggered my interest in the military. My dad was in the Second World War. He actually was over in Germany, and he actually was in occupation in Germany during that time. My grandfather was in the First World War, and he was in the number 2 construction company. My dad was very, very actively involved in the Legion, and he was a very passionate individual. I'm high strung, I talk a lot, and he made me look like a baby. He was a very intense person. And I heard somebody talk about finding a place to relax. Dad struggled with that. And in the Black community, you're trying to survive a lot of times. And he was a survivor. Went through the depression and all that type of thing. So when you think about being Black, it's really, really difficult for us to relax because we're always trying to survive. So when Shakira asked me to do this project, first of all I said, to be honest, is there anybody in the community that would want to do this? Because I didn't want to step on people's toes. I don't want to go into a community where I am sort of not wanted, but try to do this project. And she come back and said, no. And I said, I'm on board. And I started right away. Just as soon as she told me that gave me the go-ahead, I started right away, and became passionate about this. I think it was 4 or 5 months. So I think she had a few names, but she didn't have the complete list of the soldiers from Weymouth who were in the number 2 construction. So I ended up identifying 11. So this is a story of 11 Black men. They were ages of 18 to 30 from this small, isolated Weymouth Falls Black community. 2 were married. 1 who had children. So when you're married and you have children and you leave, these men really wanted to serve the country. 4 were living in the US, and that was interesting to me. I was really surprised to find out that 4 were in the US, and they came back and stayed with relatives to join this unit. These men were told that it was a white man's war. These men were told, we'll call you when we need you. And you know what that really means. They ain't gonna call. These men were told in Southwest Nova, which is my area, and Weymouth Falls area, that we don't want a checkerboard army. Which all these were very hurtful for me when I found this story out. And I think probably, like, I really was into Army cadets. I almost went into the armed forces. My dad was involved. My granddad was involved. I was proud of our armed forces until I found this story out. So we actually were denied the right to bear arms, denied the right to die for our country. When you think about that, it's just, it hurts right here to the soul. They were volunteers, rejected because of their race and their color. So eventually, they formed this unit. And I'll give you a little overview of the battalion and how it was formed. So the battalion was created July the 16th, 1916, 109 years ago. Volunteers came, and this is amazing for me, all over Canada and from the US and from the West Indies. There were 600 men who were eventually accepted. So the 11 men from Weymouth Falls were part of this unit. in May of 1917, in March of 1917, they sailed from Halifax to England. So I could imagine what that trip was like. And these men were in an isolated community, Weymouth Falls. It probably had never been, of course, over to Europe. It must have been quite a change for them. So in May of 1917, they arrived in France and began operating cutting lumber and supporting the war operations in southeast France. They operated and administrating water systems and supplied all camps and maintained roads and helped to build logging railways. So some of those people were rejected actually when they were in training in Pictou. One of them, particularly from Weymouth, was because he had a disability. And I think it simply was that he had lost one of his fingers. And I really would debate that he didn't have that ability to be able to at least use a shovel, at least cut lumber. So that was probably racism. We don't know that for sure. So when I did the research, as a researcher, I used Nova Scotia Archives. I used the family.com to get my information. And then I used the military records, which was quite accurate for the most part. And that gave me a real good picture of these men. Shakira wanted me to do before. What were they like before? What was their lives like before? During was fairly easy because the military had really good, accurate records. And then after. And the after was the hard one because you want to find out a lot about their lives. And in the Black community, records are really hard to come by. But I was able to do some. There were some that had obituaries. So we have an example of what I did there. It's on the screen now. And we used Aubrey Jarvis, which happened to be Shakira's great-great-grandfather. And so what I did is who his parents were, his date of birth, the place of birth, the occupation, his religion. And there were 2 churches in Weymouth. And I think I forgot to mention that my mother was from Weymouth Falls. And she used to tell me she would go to the Church of England service in the morning and then to the Baptist church in the afternoon. She was quite religious. And the enlistment date, that's important. The age, regimental number. Now, your regimental number is really important. So if anybody wanted to know whether their relative was involved in the number 2 construction, all the numbers start with 93. My wife's father was in World War I. We thought he was in this unit, but when we check his number, it doesn't start with 93. So there were some people that weren't discriminated against from the African Nova Scotia community that were able to get into to serve in World War I, and some beared arms and were in the trenches. And the date of birth, in some cases that was hard to find, and the cause of death also. Obituaries were not really something that you'd find for a lot of people in the Black community. Generally speaking, I think that might have been that era too, because if you were not somebody of importance, you didn't get an obituary. Kathy Jarvis God, because I'm 110 years old was just an amazing. So that was the project that I did, and it was really exhilarating. It was exciting to do that, and I just really felt very fortunate to be able to search those men. I had done a project in Yarmouth similar to this. It was one where we were going to create a panel and also a monument of the 16 men that served in that unit. And so we spent 16 months on that one. And when Shakira called me, I was just fresh off of that, but it just made sense. But actually, part of our motivation in Yarmouth was to inspire other communities to do this, so it was really fit in. And I think I'm taking up too much time now. So I want to thank you very much. And again, thanks, Shakira.
Yeah, so there's a lot of information there. So thank you, Mr. Chuck, for participating. But again, this work is so important to our community land trust because uncovering the stories of these men is a reminder that the land we're working to protect and preserve has always been home to people who served, who resisted, and who built community under incredibly difficult circumstances. So as you saw from my great-great-grandfather's profile, we're getting so much information. Military records really do offer a deep and detailed account of individuals and by extension of community experiences that would otherwise be challenging, if not impossible, to find. So, Mr. Chuck uncovered birth and death dates, religious affiliations, professions, partner and children's names, marital status, cause of death, like migration patterns. There's also a really interesting connection that he uncovered between Canada and the US, but he also uncovered, which you did not mention, that Tristan Thompson is he's connected to us somehow. Someone in there is like his descendant. So it's time for the money to come home, Tristan. Middleton, yes. So he's my cousin. But anyways, these are scans of actual documents that Mr. Chuck was able to find, and I thought it was just important to show you like how much work really went into that. And again, because we don't see our community land trust as a simple mechanism for development, but rather as an opportunity to reclaim and steward land in ways that reflect the history, identity, and aspirations of the community. Researching these men helped us paint that picture of what their lives and again the community of Weymouth Falls might have looked like. So, historical research helps us reclaim stories that connect people to land in very deep and personal ways. And when we know our history, we don't just hold the land, but we're actually able to carry its meaning. I see Josh taking a picture. I was going to wait. I was leaving it there for you. All right. So switching gears a little bit, I now want to pass the mic off to Sophia. So Sophia is our climate lead. She works for the Clean Foundation. She'll introduce herself when she comes up, but her presentation is incredible because it really positions the climate or the CLT movement in the climate space in ways that can really help us understand community narratives and ingrain them into the way that we think and do climate work. So over to you, Sophia.
Thanks, Shakira. It's really exciting to be in front of you all. This is my first CNCLT conference, and the vibe is awesome, so I'm really excited to be here. I wanted to introduce myself by connecting to the land that I'm originally from, the land of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee in Cataraqui, so-called Kingston, Ontario. That's where I grew up, and now I'm lucky to call Mi'kma'ki home here in Chibuktuk in Halifax. My background is in community development. I also went to Acadia University, maybe a few years after Mr. Chuck. And I have done lots of different kinds of community development work, but right now I'm doing local climate action. Oh, and the clicker is here. And how do I use it? There we go. Okay. Like Shakira said, I work for the Clean Foundation. So the Clean Foundation is an environmental nonprofit that was established in the 80s. We're really focused on service delivery. So we do this by bringing together specialized teams to solve complex climate problems. We do this by initiating local climate work. This looks like clean transportation. This could be workforce development, coastal protection, climate action, and lots more. As Shakira mentioned, I work for the Community Climate Capacity Program. So this program was developed in response to an identified gap that we saw in local climate work. So communities were really struggling to do climate action, especially municipalities. They lacked the staff, the resources, the expertise to engage in climate work. And so the Community Climate Capacity Program was developed to respond to this by partnering local communities with climate expertise. We do this first and foremost. Oh, that is just me still, actually. Here we go. We do this first and foremost by adding staff capacity to these organizations. So in the 19 communities who were accepted into the first cohort of this program, they identified priority projects to be accomplished, and then they were paired with staff. So they were paired with climate experts who helped them accomplish these projects. These were wide-ranging. They looked at things like stormwater management, land use planning, policy development. The program was really designed to be tailorable to the specific needs of each community that we're working with. We're serving communities across the province, and the project is meant to be responsive to the, like constantly changing impacts of climate change over time. And not to bury the lead, but the Weymouth Falls CLT is one of the communities in this program, and I'm their climate lead. So Shakira and I have been working together now for just over a year and a half, and I think we've been up to some pretty cool stuff. We began our work together looking at kind of historical land use in Weymouth Falls and how that's changed over time. And then we did some foundation building. We looked at funding streams and how we could work to support future climate projects. But the majority of our work has really been based in community engagement. So we were really interested in grounding ourselves in community. And I would say that that's become kind of the cornerstone of the work that we're doing together. So when we think about climate data, this is, it's a really great time to be doing climate work because we have more access to climate data now than ever before. And this is really important, especially as we're thinking about living in a world with precarious climate. We need to be able to make informed decisions about how to live in the next 10, 20, 50 years. But that data only tells us so much. For example, if you look at this chart, you can see that the annual hottest day in Weymouth Falls is going to become almost 5 degrees warmer before the end of the century. And that tells us that we need to be thinking about things like public cooling spaces, home insulation. But this only tells us one part of the story. When we are thinking about climate work, climate data is kind of a flat narrative. So for example, if you think about like the weather app on your iPhone and it says that it's like sunny outside and then you look outside and it's raining, that's not very helpful, is it? And that's kind of the same thing when we don't connect data to the lived experience of the community. So the way that we decided to understand climate change through the perspective of the community in Weymouth Falls is by engaging the community in mapping workshops. And so we invited the Weymouth Falls community to come together and help us map the Weymouth Falls community through their own perspective. And these workshops were amazing. They were full of people coming together, like reconnecting to begin with, and then also sharing their collective histories of what it meant to live in Weymouth Falls. So we gathered a lot of data. Each of these points that you can see on the right map really tells us a story, not only a story that allows us to kind of preserve the history of the community, but also a story about how the community has experienced climate change. These points are ways that community members, residents of Weymouth Falls, have connected to land over time. You know, people were able to look at a satellite map and see like a specific tiny little house on a point and know not just who lives there today, but who's lived there for the past 5 generations. That's incredible. And only somebody who has the experience of growing up in that community would be able to do that kind of mapping with the precision, with the familiarity that we saw. And so as we're activating climate work in Weymouth Falls, and before handing it back to you, Shakira, I want to do a shameless plug about why I think that CLTs are the perfect place for meaningful climate action to happen, and also maybe how you can recognize that climate change work is already happening in the CLT space. I think that there's a misconception that climate work has to be like building renewable energy. But when I think that mitigation, you know, reducing greenhouse gases, that's an important piece of climate action, especially when we're thinking about things like infrastructure, when we're thinking about things like land use planning. But today I want to talk about adaptation. To me, adaptation means building an ability for people, for communities to be resilient to the impacts of climate change. So, you know, things like extreme weather, extreme heat, flooding, wildfire. These are the impacts of climate change. And the community land trusts operate in a space where we really feel these impacts the most through infrastructure, on the land, with the people. And by building things like practices of mutual aid, of community connection, of emergency preparedness, and we're thinking about the communities that we're serving and how we can make sure that we're building their resiliency to climate change. That's how we build resiliency and adaptivity. That's how we kind of increase our adaptive capacity. Before handing it back to Shakira, I just want to highlight how impressive the Weymouth Falls CLT's participation has been in the CCC program and the Community Climate Capacity Program. So the Weymouth Falls CLT is the only CLT. It's the only African Nova Scotian community and beyond one Mi'kmaq community in Cape Breton. It's the only non-municipal organization that's doing work in this program. And although that means that the support that we're providing, Shakira, looks a bit different than the work we do with municipalities, it's been just as, if not sometimes more impactful. And so I hope that today you can take away or maybe reframe the way that you're thinking about CLT work, not only as work to build community, you know, to preserve heritage, but also work to build climate adaptation and to build resiliency. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. And yeah, I guess just building off of what Sophia shared, you know, the data, as she mentioned, says one story, but talking to people and finding out, you know, used to pick berries here, they don't grow anymore. Used to skate on that pond doesn't freeze anymore. Used to fish here, fish no longer spawn here anymore. Like those are ways of understanding climate that is actually accessible for the community. Whereas, you know, that data, if we showed that to them, it doesn't mean anything for them. So understanding how climate impacts day-to-day lives and also over generations, like Sophia said, which is a gift that African Nova Scotian communities have because they've been there so long. That's really how our climate work is coming to life. So yeah, very different than the municipal groups, but as you said, still impactful. And yeah, so I mean, I just kind of spoke to this, but you know, once we have a deep understanding of the historical relationship between land and people, we're able to make more responsive land use and climate planning decisions. And so Sophia spoke to the mapping workshops that we did. And while those workshops did provide us some climate information that's extremely relevant, we were actually able to leverage that information in other ways too. So we developed an acquisition strategy based on that. So when we were in the mapping workshops, we would ask people, you know, what are the 3 sites of most significance to you? And then at the end of the sessions, we kind of came out with the top 3 based on what the community had said. So all of these images are scaled the same. That's why, you know, some are smaller and some are bigger, but the yellow parcels kind of indicate those sites that were the most significant. So the top site of significance was the Sam Langford Community Center. So that is a dilapidated building. It's out of use. You can't enter it, but the community still sees value in it because it's historically been the hub of the community. And before it was a community center, it was actually the site of the segregated school, because yes, schools are segregated in Canada, with the last segregated school having closed in Nova Scotia in the 80s. But it's always been a historically important site. So that's what the community said was their top priority. The other two sites, Mount Beulah Baptist Church, so that obviously religion is extremely important to African Nova Scotians. And so that Baptist Church was the site of both religious and political organizing. And then we have the dam. So it's called the dam because Nova Scotia Power installed a water dam there, and people were using it before the water dam was installed, but they still found use for it after. And that dam has actually been decommissioned, but it's been significant because it's a place of recreation. It was a place for fishing before the dam, but the community has always found that property really significant. And so we created a strategy out of this, right? These sites of significance. And now getting back to what everyone's really excited about, we were able to acquire one of these sites. So in February of 2025, the Weymouth Falls Community Land Trust acquired the Mount Beulah Baptist Church. And that's very clearly a direct response to community needs. So this site is historically significant for a lot of reasons. But I'll point out that the photo that's on the left for you, left, it was taken in 1901 on the property. So this was the congregation at the time. And the land was actually deeded by the Langford family in the 1880s for religious activity. Now the picture on the right, again, our logo, it is of the church. So this was built in 1921. The current iteration that still sits there looks, well, yeah, it's this envelope, and it's been there since 1921. So the structure itself has been standing there for over 100 years, but similar to the community center, it is not in use. It's a condemned building, and so we were able to acquire it and bring it back into community hands. So with that, yeah, actually, I should also mention, so this, like, I keep saying it's historically significant, but I need to mention the AUBA too, because so the African United Baptist Association is one of the longest, if not the longest active Black organizations in Canada. They've been operational since 1854, and this was one of the first 7 churches that the African United Baptist Association and Richard Preston established. There's marked graves behind it that are dated in 1895. So that would have been the original Black settler. So it's a very significant site, but I'm going to pass it off to Zara, who's going to give us an architectural view of what we're kind of planning for that site.
Hi, everyone. So I am the last of the 4 of us who are going to speak. My name is Zara. Many of my friends call me Z, and I'm a registered architect and principal at ZAP Architecture and Planning. We are a small independent firm located in downtown Dartmouth. And I'm also faculty at Dalhousie School of Architecture and Planning. If I was going to describe our practice, I would say that we are centered on impact in place. And we try to practice culturally responsive design, and we implement community engagement strategies with equity at its core, wherever possible. We also have founded ZAP Design Futures, which is a community-rooted program that introduces architecture and planning to equity-deserving youth. And we do it with using projects that we have in the office, workshops, mentorship, and job shadowing. And it's really critical that next generations see themselves in shaping spaces that hold our stories. So that's kind of the fundamental idea behind it. I think it's also important that I point out I'm not African Nova Scotian, and my last name is Williams. So that's a very common name in the 52 communities. My Williams is actually from Barbados. And I have a weird connection to everyone in my Williams is from Barbados, and Weymouth Falls has a a really critical, I guess, Bajan descendant community with the bishops who are mentioned in one of the names. And my mom, on my mom's side, my family is multi-generational Canadian, but my dad came here in the 1960s, specifically to Anishinaabe land, to Kingston, because he was a cadet. So, so I tell them all I'm a glue holding everyone together. Um, so community land trusts have been a really interesting mechanism for us, and currently we are associated with both Weymouth Falls Community Land Trust and Upper Hammonds Plains. Very different work, and we're really happy to talk about this project because often in the case of Nova Scotia, we're talking about housing and that as a mechanism for community development. So it's really important to bring that context of community space and how that can build and reinforce cultural history and legacy. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why this project was so important, specifically to start with Mount Beulah Baptist Church. And we like the term right size first project because it's an opportunity to build trust. And the context of Weymouth Falls specifically, Shakara mentioned that there were two buildings that were worth consideration with the Sam Langford Community Center, which was previously the schoolhouse. Due to the current state of that building, it would have been a lot more difficult to rehabilitate it to use in the time period that we can address the Mount Beulah Church. So we felt like this project was feasible and tangible, and it also helps the CLT demonstrate momentum and deliver early wins. And it's really important that your design team thinks strategically about things like that, because the success of the project is the ability for the community to feel as if there is movements with all the time that they're investing. So start where we can succeed is the approach that we took. And the design strategy, we wanted to concentrate resources, we wanted to reduce risk, and show the community a clear path from vision to action. So the approach isn't really just about design and construction, it's also about tapping into future decision-making, operations, governance, and really understanding how the CLT wants to operate, and with design and architecture in the background. So Mount Beulah Baptist Church, this community is so interesting because often when we think about African Nova Scotian communities, we think of Baptist churches. However, with the community in Weymouth Falls, there's Catholic representation, there's Anglican representation, and there is Baptist. However, they all used this specific site for various reasons. So it's more than just a faith-based building, and this building really illustrates how a site and a structure can hold community memory and can hold celebrations. And I'll give you an example. When we were there for the reunion and we had multiple conversations with, so many Weymouth Falls family members, probably about 10 times in my notes, harvest celebrations came up. And harvest celebrations are something that went beyond the direct community church and went beyond Weymouth Falls itself. Someone mentioned coming from Digby and coming from other neighboring towns. So, understanding, oftentimes we think about structures anachronistically and we think about them based on a name. What you really have to start to understand is how the layers of cultural participation and how a building is engaged in its, many opportunities to show up in community space. The other thing that was so critical about this building, because again, when we look at the thread of many churches in African Nova Scotian communities, sometimes they are brought there. So building movement is very common in African Nova Scotian communities, and there are many examples across the province where buildings had another life before. And this may seem like a little bit of a silly example, but for example, in North Preston, the North Preston Daycare, which is the longest African Nova Scotian Scotian running daycare. That was a building that was started in Cole Harbour. It was picked up and moved to North Preston, and then later on extended and renovated by the community. And this story is not unusual. So the fact that we have a church structure that was built by local craftspeople, built in the early 20th century, and then its vernacular specifically is Carpenter Gothic. So we're tying it into an architectural legacy. There are at least 4 other structures in Nova Scotia, in African Nova Scotian communities that also follow this style. And some of the architectural motifs show up in buildings that we know. So from the cedar shingles to the open gables and that kind of rhythmic composition with the pointed arch windows, all of these are very critical elements of that Carpenter Gothic style. So what we're saying is, in addition to cultural importance, there's also architectural importance in the details, and all of these things come together to act as an anchor. They act as an anchor for memory, they act as an anchor for how we identify community. And restoring it honors the people who made it, and it keeps an irreplaceable cultural reference point in use. The other thing that I wanted to speak about is just a process that lifts up first voice stories. It's really important when we can trace the legacy, when we listen to all of the amazing historical work that Mr. Chuck has done, it starts to weave in an understanding of who built these buildings and who built this building specifically. We often hear about traveling pastors in the AUBA Baptist community, which is common in many rural contexts. And we heard lots of feedback about everyday family gatherings, but what we also heard were distinct memories. I spoke with sisters whose grandfather helped erect the tin ceilings in the church. And so there's this very visceral and tangible memory of how the church came to be. And maybe those craft makers and builders are not existing today, but that legacy was handed down. And there are people who are still living who have physical memories of people going to the church and maintaining it and building it. So, these memories are what guide our preservation priorities. And as we follow a design approach, it is really critical for me to explain that design should have priorities. And those priorities are community-based, they're project-based, and they're site-based. So the design priorities in this situation, because we're dealing with an existing building and not a new construction scenario, are identifying elements of the building that we must protect. And we must protect them because they carry the community's emotional DNA. So, the stained glass patterns are something we cannot lose that. The entry sequence, the tactile finishes, all of these things, they represent history, they cue belonging, and they also symbolize connection. So by establishing that, by having deep conversations with community members, we start to build that critical guideline. The other thing that we start to layer in is this really important work that Shakara, Sophia, and the community are doing, which is the community mapping. One of the tricky things about community engagement with design is often we come in and there's already been a significant amount of engagement, and community members get fatigue. By the time we get there, it's like, we've already asked these questions, we've already answered these questions, we've been here before. And so part of what we need to do is layer in the different pieces of information that other teams have connected and use that to help build our jump off point. So when I sit down with community members, it's not the beginning, it's part of a continuum of stories that we're collecting, and it also allows us to have a much deeper conversation because it's not a starting point. It's not basic facts that we're trying to get into. It's how do you use the space? How do you remember the space? And so the history and community mapping, that directly translated into some really interesting cues and moves which we can make on the site. And to give you two examples, in the various stories and mapping elements of the community, there is an area that's called the French Pasture. And the story of the French Pasture, which is, it's actually, there was an agreement between the Acadian community and the community of Weymouth Falls, and that Acadian community would come up and they would graze their animals. And many people were like, I didn't actually know why it was called the French Pasture. And so when we start to work on this building, it's also an opportunity for us to make nods to other important sites, like the Sam Lamford Center, like the French Pasture, and like the dam. And that then ties into this understanding of operational aspects of design. What that means is when a building is closed, when it's in operation, but the doors are shut, so maybe it's after hours or on a Sunday when it's closed, the physical site can also tell a story. Because the stories aren't just Weymouth Falls stories, they're not just Nova Scotian stories, these are Canadian histories. So again, these are these stories that are creating narratives and are really directing how we want to show and display interpretive movements and spatial cues on the site. The other thing I'll say is it's not just design on the building, it's not just site design on the landscape. These stories will also inform how we do wayfinding and signage on the site. And really how this project begins to embody both land, lineage, and lived experience. I think I would take a second here just to say that a lot of the work that's done in architecture and design is often felt like it's tangible things. But the root of what we're trying to do is to really think about community well-being. So Sophia mentioned, some other ways to think about climate sustainability and cultural resilience. And when we think about this preservation first approach for this project, where we're starting with an existing building, we're also thinking about how to make sustainable decisions. Because the most sustainable building is the building that already exists. When you think about greenhouse gas effects and carbon emissions, construction industry is one of the highest industries on that chart. And so when we're dealing in a rural context, and that's a context that often is hard to complete new construction projects, both because of geographical location, but also often we're in areas where there's limited servicing. We need to think about different strategies that are going to work both for the communities that are there. They're going to honor the past, but also, not disrupt the future negatively. So for this project, we carry that meaning through trying to repair first, trying to minimize new materials where possible, reduce carbon costs and disruption, and all that hopefully while protecting cultural continuity. Seems like a lot. We're also trying to do that by thinking about well-being in the current day context, because well-being changes over time. And in this situation, we need to think about barrier-free accessibility. We need to think about safe gathering places. And in this community specifically, we need to think about thermal comfort. Summers are hotter, winters are colder. What do people do when their home doesn't adequately protect them to the climate considerations that we need to think about now? What it means is this project as a community space needs to be able to function and answer all of those questions. It needs to be a safe place for people. It needs to be the warming center. It needs to be the cooling center. And it needs to be able to respond to the many different needs, because a building is a big investment. Construction is expensive no matter what you do. So if we're going to put this cost in this building, it needs to be a multi-hyphenate, multi-functioning building. And all of that kind of contributes to that story of cultural resiliency. So as we came to the site, that was kind of a side note, as we came to the site, One of the first things that we did, because this is a co-led, and co-led in this situation is different sometimes to other communities. When you're working with cultural communities, you often have the opportunity to do co-led, which is descendant-led work. So we attended I attended the reunion, spent the weekend, and the first thing that we did on the Saturday morning, or was that the Sunday morning? Sunday morning, we walked the site with community. And we heard firsthand stories of things that were really, really just interesting and critical memories of, blueberry foraging on the land. Shakara mentioned the grave sites, 3 dated 1890s, and there's one that was a baby's gravestone. So, as we move forward, and it's kind of, you couldn't see it from the street. We had to walk through the cluster of trees, which community members are clearing and maintaining so that we could safely get there. And as we're telling this story, our signage and wayfinding needs to tell people there's something here, which is important. And so the site, it became part of that story of design guides. And the things that we learn, they're going to show up in our drawings, our details, and hopefully our experiential moments. The other thing I think that's critical, and I'm hoping maybe you're picking that up in where in what I'm trying to express, and that's design isn't imposed. So it's supposed to be a shared process. I think often there's this notion of like the architect, the master crafter. In this space, the way designers should show up is they listen, they hear, and they reflect. And it's an iterative process. And we value the pace, we value the relationship, the clarity around shared ownership, and the transparency with decision making. What that does mean is sometimes the projects are longer than a typical new construction, but that's all part of the story, and it's why the end result can often be more meaningful. So success is when people say we are seen, we feel heard, and when the choices and the histories that were explained to us show up in the drawings, and where people can feel like the building reflects their community voice. So design is narrative. I picked these images just to explain that a project is more than a technical document. An architectural site plan is not that interesting on paper. Where it comes alive is with the experiential moments that we hope to create. We weave motifs and patterns that surface in our research, that surface in the window rhythms, the entry thresholds, the landscape roofs, the critical paths around the site. That's really, it's in the experience of architecture. That's really where it gets interesting. So the community mapping that Shakara, Sophia, and the community came in to do, that informed how we want to gather the site, how we want to move through the site, and what we want to interpret for visitors to see. If somebody is coming to Weymouth Falls for the first time and they know nothing, this project should be able to reflect that history. So in community space, specifically, function must meet meaning. I mentioned earlier on, the building needed to be barrier-free, needs to be safe, it needs to be serviceable, because right now the only service that's available is electrical power, essentially. Because the building has been closed and unserviced for so long, we need to understand how we can stabilize the building, protect it weather-wise, ventilate it, and do all the things that we need to do that are expected of a modern building without erasing the fabric in the past. We also need to do that by balancing this kind of intergenerational use that has been so clearly expected by the community. So I'm going to show you an image, an idea of what we could do. And I share this with you to just give an example, because the structure itself looks quite like the original structure. But in this idea, it's restored to its original grace and glory. that's very on the nose, but the landscape remains intact. We intend to bring back the native species that were there, that, elders explained to us, the blueberry fields, the areas to forage. And we're only going to add the necessary design interventions that are required to make the space accessible, walkable, accessible in terms of mobility, accessible in terms of vision, kind of all the accessible with a large A. We also will be developing a narrative signage, so the story is legible, as I mentioned, whether the doors are open or closed. We're exploring ideas like, how do we host a community photography archive? Many people, when they're moving away, they have all these photos, they want some place to capture it, they want to share it with others. How can this building be a place, a repository for that type of work? How can we display a living family history tree where memory is made, kept, and taught? So, you could come to the site and see your lineage. And how can this building become a landmark for Weymouth Falls that, holds a very particular history, which is special and needs to be remembered? So to wrap up, the CLT isn't just restoring a building, it's building capacity, knowledge, and a future rooted in justice and belonging. And the design is really the backdrop to that. We're just the background. And it's a collective effort, and we're really hoping that, everyone's stories feel like they're heard, and we're excited about the future of this project. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Zara. So I just have 2 more slides here. I will say, even though it was advertised as a panel, I don't think that we're gonna have time to talk, but we'll be here, so you can ask us questions or we can chat. But I just wanted to kind of feed off of what Zara was just saying about, that future-oriented vision. And so again, we're always thinking about, what are we going to do next? We want to make sure that the actions that we're doing now actually will lead to something else. And so I wanted to give you kind of an organizational snapshot of our snapshot of what we're thinking about right now. So, the year's not done. We have a few months left and we have plans. So we'll be starting to develop a 10-year energy transition plan with the Clean Foundation and some external consultants. A lot of folks in the community, deeply rural, are living on oil and gas heating, for example, and that's extremely expensive, especially in a low-income community. So what does it look like to transition out of that? That's what we're going to be looking at. We also want to grow our membership. We want to establish new partnerships. We have a study tour coming up in November. That is actually through a research project with the University of Virginia. It's called the Outsider Preservation Initiative, and they chose 8 organizations from across Canada and the US to participate. These organizations had to have a focus on preserving Black freedom colonies, is how they define them. And we're the only Canadian organization that they've chosen for this. So yeah, we're really excited. Because it's helping us continue that legacy that we talked about at the start. And we also have a funding application in that we will be hearing back from by the end of the month, and it would cover the entire design process. So everything that Zara was just talking about, that would all be funded if we get the result that we're hoping for. But Zara helped us put together an incredible proposal, and Sophia wrote the application, so I think we have good odds. So yeah, just to speed through, 26, 27, we are thinking about, how can we be sustainable within ourselves? How can we look at creating a business plan that allows us to start to have operational positions that we can self-fund or at least contribute to, from revenue generation. We also, are looking at, how can we raise funding to start acquiring land? $500,000 in HRM will not take you very far. $500,000 in a rural community, we would amass significant amount of land for that. And also because we have these energy projects that we're thinking about, that could then lead to revenue generation. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about over the next few years. And so to wrap up, well, actually, first of all, I need to mention that when Zara was saying, community members go and they cleared the path so that we could participate in that tour, need to point out Jermaine Langford over here taking all the photos, but because Jermaine is the one taking care of the community. He's there. He goes back and forth, but he is the one taking care of the community, making sure that these sites are well taken care of. As I've been clear, I don't live there, and so I need to mention you, Jermaine, because you're here. But yeah, so just to wrap up, I just want to say that, prioritizing preservation was the name of our presentation. And the reason why we do that is because our CLT is prioritizing these existing spaces because we understand that community well-being, cultural resilience, and sustainable development requires strong functional communal infrastructure. And so when we look at the Mount Beulah example, that site honors the legacy of the community, but it also will help us restore community pride and provide immediate, visible improvements that build trust and engagement with the community itself. So in revitalizing community spaces like this, they're also going to be able to serve as essential support systems when we start looking at future housing developments, because these spaces can offer, services such as childcare, job training, health resources, a place to gather, those things that really enhance the livability and social cohesion of a community. And so, to wrap up, by reviving our past to ground our future, we're integrating community memory into the fabric of how we think about development and redevelopment. So thank you very much.